Hello and welcome. This is Professor Zufari. In this video we're going to begin exploring the Middle East. We're going to take a look at several maps that are going to show us the geography of the Middle East as well as where different ethnic groups reside and population densities. These maps are going to give us a great way to begin looking at who lives in the Middle East, where they live, and how their lives might be influenced by the geography and terrain and climate in which they live. This video gives us a great overview of the imperial history of the Middle East. What we'll see is the various civilizations that have ruled the Middle East. And as we continue our studies this semester, we'll learn more about how each of these civilizations has left its mark on Middle Eastern culture. Beginning in the centuries before the Common Era, we have the ancient civilizations of the Egyptians. They've certainly left their mark on the northeast corner of Africa. But other civilizations such as the Hittites, the Israelites, the Assyrians, and others have certainly left their mark as well. Our studies this semester will begin about in this time period, in the 600s of the Common Era. So what this video shows us is that we have layer upon layer of culture that is all embedded within the Middle East. Let's look at some more maps in detail. Here's a map of the ancient Near East, and it's a map that is showing us where the civilizations of the ancient Mesopotamians and Sumerians was. And as I hope you know, the civilization of the ancient Mesopotamians is in the region we now call Iraq, and it is nestled here between the Euphrates and the Tigris River. So here, right in the heart of the Middle East, is where the ancient Mesopotamian culture flourished. The ancient Egyptians, of course, were very famously a sophisticated and culturally rich civilization, with sculpture, great magnificent architectural works. We can still see the influence of ancient Egyptian art on Middle Eastern art. If you take a look at this very stylized painting from ancient Egypt, you see the profile, the elongated almond-shaped eyes are all very prominent. And in this Persian painting, you see the elongated eyes. You don't see an attempt to portray realism, but you do see a very stylized, formal approach to painting figures. The Hittites also ruled the Middle East, and they left behind some of their sculptures. You'll see some of the symbolism of the winged lion again in some Persian architecture and Persian sculpture. The stylized beard with the curls and very exact swirls and decorative units you'll see again in the Persian art. The Assyrians left their mark. You'll see the similarities, I think, readily in their sculpture between theirs and the Hittites. The Babylonian Empire left behind some mosaics, also left behind relief sculpture. The kingdom of Israel was established when the Israelites were led out of Egypt by Moses. We'll talk more about this story in the next learning unit. But the kingdom of Israel was a tumultuous one and had very few years of peace. And so much of the art and architecture from this era was destroyed, but we do have a few remnants, as you can see here. The Persian Empire was a magnificent empire, and we do have many examples of the art and architecture created by the Persians. From gold-plated drink vessels, this was meant to be a goblet for banquets, to the ruins of the great city of Persepolis, to coinage and other sculptures reflecting monarchs. And much of the artistic design and style that was developed in the Persian Empire has remained embedded within Persian culture. The Macedonian Empire is perhaps better known to us as the ancient Greek Empire. The Roman Empire, right on the heels of the ancient Greeks, left us columns, left us the great architectural works of aqueducts. We'll see these aqueducts and these arches and columns show up again and again in Middle Eastern architecture. These arches and columns that you see in the image to the left are a photograph taken from the Great Mosque of Damascus. And you can see immediately that the design of the repeating arches has been borrowed from the Romans. And you can see in this photograph that the interior of the mosque has borrowed the Corinthian column design from the ancient Romans. So although the ancient Romans Empire has long gone, its influence and its cultural influence is very much embedded in the Middle East today. The spread of religions certainly left its mark on the Middle East. As we know, the Middle East is the birthplace of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And you can see that Judaism spread from its birth and development here in the Middle East. And you can also see Christianity spreading from the Middle East. The Byzantine Empire was the empire created from the eastern remnants of the Roman Empire, and a very sophisticated style of art developed with very detailed mosaics such as this one. This is one of the most famous Byzantine mosaics, and it adorns the walls of Hagia Sophia. As the Islamic Empire is established and grows, it will take over much of what was formerly the Byzantine Empire. And this new Islamic Empire is going to be very much enthralled with the art of the Byzantines. They will hire Byzantine artisans to create works of art and architecture. And if they're not directly hiring the Byzantines, they're often copying their aesthetics and their designs. At the same time as the Byzantines ruled further to the west, the Sassanid Empire took over the Persian Empire. They left, again, a lot of relief sculpture, coinage. As we've been discussing the former civilizations that ruled the Middle East, I've been telling you that the Islamic Empire will be born in the Middle East and absorb much of the land of previous cultures. This map is showing us the spread and development of the Islamic Empire. So what you'll see is the empire that began here in the Arabian Peninsula during the 600s spread quite rapidly through lands that had been previously ruled by the Byzantines and the Sassanid Empire. The Islamic Empire will be the topic of much of our study during Unit 2. This map shows us many of the different civilizations that were ruling in the 700s. We'll be talking about the Umayyad Caliphate, but I have spelled it in a more contemporary spelling that I think is more accurate, with using the letter U rather than the letter O. Another thing I'd like to point out by this map is that you see here the Umayyad Empire is quite vast, and you also see over here in Spain is colored green, indicating it's part of the same empire. And I would disagree. Spain considered itself a separate entity, but it was at the same time as we had an Islamic empire based here in the Middle East. Spain over here was also an independent Islamic empire. So this caliphate or empire, we'll talk more about this word caliphate, spanned all the way across Northwest Africa as far as Iran and Afghanistan today. And of course, expanding across such a vast geographical region meant that there were many different cultures that were incorporated into this empire. So we see architectural influence from the ancient Greeks, from the ancient Romans, as well as this type of relief sculpture that we see that's rather similar to what we saw from the ancient Assyrians and Hittites. As I mentioned, we see columns and arches that are very borrowed directly from the ancient Romans. We'll also see the influence of the European Crusaders. They don't leave too much influence behind. We have a few fortresses, such as this one, left behind in the Middle East from the Crusaders. Saladin, or in Arabic, Salah ad-Din, will be the famous ruler who will reconquer Jerusalem from the Crusaders. His empire that he led was based here in the city of what is now known as Cairo, Egypt. And the unique developments in art that we see from this empire is a lot of etched and carved crystal. They were very much interested in using minerals in their art. We see more ornate inlaid work, as well as quite rich and luxurious gold-plated vessels. We'll see crystal goblets and very sophisticated table settings. The Mongol Empire doesn't last very long. But the Mongol Empire, based here in Central Asia, expanded both east and west. The Ottoman Empire will be the next great Middle Eastern-based empire. After the Crusaders' attacks, as well as the Mongols' attacks upon the Middle East, we'll see a very, very fragmented Middle East. It'll be the Ottoman Turks, based first and foremost here in the country we now call Turkey, who will start gathering these remnants of a fragmented Middle East and creating an empire. It will be the largest empire the Western world has seen since the ancient Roman Empire. And it'll be the Ottoman Empire that will rule the Middle East up until the modern era. As you can see here, the Ottoman Empire expands all the way into Europe. Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, Bosnia, and parts of Greece were all controlled under the Ottomans. But by the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire rapidly begins decreasing as more and more pieces of land are lost due to wars for independence. So by the 1920s, the Ottoman Empire ends, and we're left with what we know today as the Republic of Turkey. So the Ottoman Empire ruled a vast expanse of land once again, and from the Ottomans we get very distinct works of art. In the genre of calligraphy, we get even more embellished and extravagant designs, again with the very minute and precise detailed design work that we're very fond of in the Middle East. We'll see works of hand-painted pottery, rugs, as well as magnificent works of architecture. It'll also be during the 18 and 1900s that Europeans begin invading the Middle East. This will have a significant impact on the Middle East. If we look at a map of the world in the year 1900, we can see this very well. You'll see that most of the world is dominated by Europe. France here, in this map indicated with the color lavender, is controlling most of West Africa, including the countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and there'll be quite a few fierce struggles for independence from the French in the Middle East. Great Britain is also dominating much of the world, and they'll consider India and the Indian subcontinent, they'll call the crown jewel of Great Britain's overseas possessions. And so in order to sail through the Strait of Gibraltar and sail through the Red Sea in order to reach India, the British will fight quite fiercely to control Egypt and the Sudan in order to secure their passage through the Suez Canal. So Great Britain's influence will be felt across Egypt, the Sudan. They'll later control portions here of what we now call Israel, Palestine, Jordan. And the British will very much leave an influence here in Yemen, where they'll again be very much interested in securing their naval passages, as well as here in what is today the United Arab Emirates. So in this map that's written in French, you can see that the Middle East was very much carved during the early 1900s by the Middle East. The French, the Spanish, the Italians, the British, they all had their influence in the Middle East. And this will create quite a number of problems for the Middle East. So these new nations that we know today as Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, Iraq, these political boundaries are very new to the Middle East, and you'll see that most of these countries don't earn their independence until the middle of the 20th century. It'll be in 1948 that the State of Israel is founded, and these maps will give us another good insight into the development of the State of Israel. In 1947, the United Nations put forth a plan to partition the region to create two states, a state of Palestine and a state of Israel. This was the United Nations partition plan. In 1948, we had Arab armies invade the region, and after the Israeli army's counterattacks, what we're left with is essentially what becomes the State of Israel. So by 1948, we have the birth of the official State of Israel. Now, the story of Israel in the Middle East is interesting. The population of Israel is predominantly Jewish. 80% is Jewish. And of course, we still have Muslim and Christian populations living in the State of Israel. But when we come to consider the ethnic identity of Israel, we have a very complex question in front of us. Is religious affiliation an ethnicity? I would argue no. And in your textbook, I make the point that being Jewish is not an ethnicity. Yes, it is very much an identity, but it does not indicate whether your ancestors came from Europe, as many of the Ashkenazi Jews came from Europe, from former Soviet republics, or many of the Jews also came from Middle Eastern backgrounds. And so you have Middle Eastern Jews, and here this map is calling them Israeli Jews, but you had Middle Eastern Jews who came from countries such as Syria, from Iraq, and they have a very different ethnicity. They had different languages, they have different facial features. So you have Jewish populations in the State of Israel that is within that 80% who are from European and American backgrounds, who are from Middle Eastern backgrounds, who are from African backgrounds, as well as Asian backgrounds. So it's a very interesting story and question how to define the Jews of Israel. And from my perspective, I think it is significant to note the Jewish identity and to also break down that Jewish ethnicity, that Jewish identity into specific ethnic groups, European Jews as well as Middle Eastern Jews. So let's take a look at this map. This map that shows us the geographical layout of the Middle East can tell us a lot. First and foremost, notice where the mountains are. Mountains are not very easy to cross. And so what you'll see is that different ethnic groups tended to be isolated by the mountain regions within which they lived. So you see Turks, for example, the ethnic group of the Turks are located here in, surprise, surprise, what is today called the country of Turkey, but you'll see that they don't come much further south. You'll see that there are more people who are of Turkish ethnic origin over here in the countries of what are today Turkmen and Azerbaijan, and you even have Turkic people living today in Iran, but you don't see so many Turkish people, Turkish ethnicities living further south. This map also helps explain to us why here in the country of Saudi Arabia, the western portion of Saudi Arabia has a different culture and even a different language dialect than the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, and it's because of the mountains. So geographical maps can tell us quite a bit, and if we want to go back to our token Arab dude, the population of Arabs in the Middle East is predominantly along these regions that we're seeing. The Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, mostly the north of Egypt, as well as the area here along the Mediterranean Sea, into Iraq, and along the Arabian Peninsula. If we move on to the next ethnic group, the Kurdish people, the Kurdish people are located predominantly in the countries of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. So Kurdish people in many countries have assimilated and intermarried, but there's still a unique and distinct Kurdish language as well as Kurdish traditions. The distribution of Kurdish populations among Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran is as you can see here. In the country of Syria, 90% of the country is ethnically Arab, and about 10% of the country is Kurdish, Armenian, and people of other ethnicities. A large part of this 10%, however, is Kurdish. In Turkey, the percentage is higher. About 20% of the population of Turkey is Kurdish. In the country of Iraq, the population of Kurds is 15 to 20%, and in the country of Iran, the Kurds are close to 7%. The next group are our Persians, and if you like to watch smut television like I do, there's a program on Bravo TV called The Shahs of Sunset, and this is one of the characters. His name is Riza. So I'm being a little bit silly with these pictures, but hopefully in a way they'll help to capture some of this information. So here's a pretty interesting map of the country of Iran. And what I hope you'll notice right away is here's the boundaries, and notice how many different colors there are within its borders. And what this tells us is the ethnicity of the Persians here in the lavender color is certainly the largest ethnic group represented, but there are so many more. If we look over here, the second largest ethnicity in Iran is actually Azerbaijani or Azari. And just to the north of Iran, we have a country here that is Azerbaijan. And interestingly, there's a country named Azerbaijan, but there are more Azerbaijanis or more people of Azari ethnic identity in Iran than there actually are in Azerbaijan. So even when we refer to the people of Iran as Persians, as many of the characters on the Shahs of Sunset refer to themselves, not all people of Iran are Persians. It's a much more complex melting pot. The last group are the Turks, and the Turks are located predominantly in Turkey. And there are, of course, some populations of Turks outside of the political boundaries of the country of Turkey, but most of the people of Turkish ethnicity are living in the country of Turkey. So the next map to discuss is this one. It shows us where the oil and gas pipelines are across the Middle East. So what this tells us then, right away, is which countries are more affluent than others. And when we talk about the modern Middle East, we'll make sure and note that there's a very significant difference in the cultural developments between oil-rich countries and non-oil-rich countries. Because certainly with the wealth that oil brings to their countries, places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar have much more access to money, and they experience a tremendous growth spurt. And so we see the skyscrapers. The city of Dubai is another great example for growing quite rapidly and extravagantly. The oil-rich countries really began their boom during the 1960s and 70s, and for some countries it's still continuing. So when we look at the population of oil-rich countries such as Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, we see that there's a much larger percentage of people who are not native. So if we pay attention to this graph showing us the population of Kuwait, only 45% of Kuwait's population are native Kuwaiti. The rest, 35%, are Arabs from other nations who have come to work in Kuwait. We have South Asians, people from the countries of Pakistan, the countries of Bangladesh, India, who've also come to Kuwait. Qatar, or in American pronunciation Qatar, is another oil-rich country. 40% of its population total are Arab, and that includes native Qatari and Arabs from other countries. So 60% of this country are definitely foreigners. Pakistanis coming to Qatar to work, 18%. Indians coming to the country, Iranis are 10%, and then another 14% are other, from other countries. And as I look at this graph of the United Arab Emirates population, somebody really screwed up, because they have here that 19% of the population are native Emiratis, but they have the graph showing them to be 50%. So somebody doesn't know their colors. But it's the South Asian population, people from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, who are 50% of this country's population. And many of these people have come for the jobs. There's a tremendous number of jobs that have been available in the United Arab Emirates over the past 20 years in construction, in management, and finance. So 50% of this country's population are from South Asia. And then we have other Arabs, people of other nationalities, that are about 23% of the country's population. Only 19% of the country's population is native, and other expatriates such as Americans, Europeans, or East Asians is another 8% of the population. If we look at this map, it tells us the religious communities of the Middle East. And you'll notice mostly green, representing the religion of Islam. The lighter green color represents the denomination of Islam known as Sunni. We'll talk more about this in Unit 2. And the darker green represents the denomination of Islam Shi'ism. In the country of Israel, of course, we have a predominant presence of Jews. And in the Middle East, we also have a number of Christian communities here along the Mediterranean, here in the region of the country that is Syria, and here in Iraq, and down here you can see in Ethiopia as well as in Egypt. This is a map that shows us which countries recognize Arabic as the only official language of the state. So, if you go to the country of Oman, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, Arabic is the only official language. Just as in the United States, the language of English is our only recognized state language. If you go to the countries of Morocco or Sudan, there are multiple languages recognized as official state languages, including Arabic, but not only Arabic. So we come back to the point that I make in the textbook. The Arabic language is key to unifying this region. And this map breaks it down even further by showing us the multiple dialects of Arabic that are used today. Again, as I pointed out in the textbook, Arabic is a macro language with numerous dialects that are being used. So when it comes to the written form, Classical Arabic is standard, but the spoken form of Arabic has multiple dialects. Here's a map that shows us the conflict that's been going on over the past 4 years. The Arab Spring is the term that's been used to refer to the revolutions in the countries of Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria. There were even, as you can see from the map, breakouts of violence in the country of Yemen, and there were a few skirmishes in Jordan. So this map shows us where most of the revolution's struggles have been. And this map, I think, is a perfect one to end on. This is actually not a map, but an image taken of the Middle East from outer space. And very quickly you can see that the electricity and the lights indicate to us the most densely populated regions of the Middle East.